What does positive animal welfare mean to you? What is animal flourishing and animal happiness? And can we achieve these in current farming systems? Welcome to the Lifting Animals' Lives podcast. Our first guest is Dr. Laura Webb, Assistant Professor at Wageningen University and Vice Chair of the Lift Cost Action. We hope you enjoy this conversation between Laura and episode host, Suzanne Truong.
We're very excited to have Dr. Laura Webb joining us today to kick off our podcast series and introduce our listeners to Lift. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you.
To start off, can you tell us the story about how Lift came about? What inspired you and Margaret to start this project?
Well, it's actually Irene Kamerlink, the science communication coordinator, who contacted me. So she came up with this idea, but she contacted me because she became aware of my paper, What is Animal Happiness? And she wanted to start a cost action on positive animal welfare. And then it is the two of us who decided to contact Margit. So Margit was the last one to come into our trial. And then, the three of us developed the proposal together.
It's always really nice to hear how things come about, like how they started, and to see now that Lift has more than 350 members across 40 different countries is quite amazing, right?
Yeah, it's more than we expected, to be honest. It grew very fast, which is really nice. It's still growing, yeah.
So we're now entering our fourth year of Lift, and one of the major outputs that have come out this year from Lift was the Positive Animal Welfare Definition paper. And you were one of the co-authors on this paper. We'd love to know more about your perspective. Could you tell us one aspect you really like about the definition and one aspect that you feel will be the most challenging to work with?
So the aspect that I really like is also the most challenging. So it's the same one. But basically, I really like that this definition goes beyond other definitions of welfare by mentioning the term flourishing. So our idea with this definition was not to restrict ourselves. We wanted to be visionary and aspirational and be inspired by positive psychology. So we want animal welfare science to be unrestricted in how far it can go into the positive side, to really aim for a great life wherever possible, not just a life worth living. But the problem is that the term flourishing is a complex one. Even in humans, the definition is a composite one. So that means it combines multiple concepts into one. And this makes it super difficult for animal welfare scientists to translate this definition into a practical applied method for assessment, for example. So within the working group 2, which is about methodologies, we're preparing a manuscript currently on possible methodologies. So it's more like a conceptual one, but it's about possible methodologies to address the definition and specifically the 3 concepts that are in that definition included into the flourishing concept, which are predominantly a positive mental state, competence, development, and resilience. We basically, with this definition, also really wanted to stress that we go beyond good health. And of course, we need to understand how different species would flourish, right? So what this means, depending on the species.
That's really interesting to hear because I think flourishing was definitely the term that stood out to a lot of people, and both in the sense of like a pleasant surprise, but also like, oh, wow, how do we tackle this term? How do we implement it eventually? But as you say, it's a conceptual thing, and it's really nice to hear that it was trying to push beyond what we've done in the past. So there is a question that often comes up when we talk about positive animal welfare, which is how is positive animal welfare different to animal welfare? Because some see it as just an update of the animal welfare definition since it's dynamic and evolving. And so what are your thoughts?
So I think in the paper, basically, we state that the positive animal welfare definition, the PAW, we call it the PAW definition, is complementary to existing definitions of animal welfare. So we can imagine these 2 concepts as being integrated, with positive animal welfare being a part of animal welfare. So if animal welfare is conceptualized as a continuum from poor to excellent, then the part that includes the excellent would reflect let's say, the proposed definition of positive animal welfare. Positive animal welfare is also what we imagined as being the dot on the horizon, so something to strive for in our endeavors towards improving captive and domesticated animal lives. In the paper, we state that our aim with this definition is to stimulate novel research to contribute to richer, more complete pictures, let's say, of animal welfare. But having said that, there are many, many definitions of animal welfare, so it depends a bit which one you pick and how they link. So yeah, it's difficult to say, I guess, without saying first, what do we think animal welfare is?
That's so true. We're still struggling to find a consensus with animal welfare, let alone positive animal welfare. But it's really nice to get this insight that you really are focusing on this top end of the spectrum. And so that's where it's really focused, right? So that makes
Yep.
a lot of sense. Yeah. So now we move on to something a little bit different. As well as being the Action Vice Chair, you are also a co-leader of several of the sub-working groups within LIFT, and one of them being the timescale of positive animal welfare. Could you briefly explain what this concept is and why it matters?
So before I try to answer, I think all the credit for the leadership should go to Laura Webb. We have almost the same name, but she's like the true leader of this sub-working group, and she would be the best person to explain this work. The idea is to try to bring the concept of affect together and closer to the concept of time and trying to understand how these two things relate to each other. So time is something that must be addressed when thinking about affective states. So what exactly are we assessing? Is it an event-based short-term emotion, or are we looking at something longer like mood, but something that's still transient? Or are we looking at something even longer than that? So in humans, you have this concept of affective happiness. So well-being, let's say, but based on your affective states. And it's quite a long-term and rather stable concept, especially in a stable context, because it's very much heavily determined by your personality, which is obviously determined by your genes and your early life experiences. So I think it's important to question these things, like what exactly are we assessing when we're trying to assess affective states? And for example, if you look at cognitive indicators of affect, a popular test is the judgment bias test that assesses animal optimism. But the question is, what is it exactly assessing and what is it exactly telling us? Is it about transient emotions, so these short-term states? For example, in the insect studies on judgment bias, they implement a change right before the test, which suggests that they are looking at emotion because they're doing something very short-term and quickly looking at the outcomes of that. In other animals, like mammals, for example, we apply long-term changes to the environment before we do the judgment bias test. So are we looking then at mood or something longer than this? So time is a really important aspect when you're assessing affect and welfare. So what aspect of welfare do you want to assess also? Something short or something long? And it's also important in terms of the specific assessment method that you select. So how often do you need to sample something to assess what you want to assess, and for how long?
I love that you mentioned your work on insects and how they have different processes. And that kind of ties into what you said before with the definition that there are these species-specific capabilities that we need to consider in terms of flourishing as well, right?
Yeah, and I think what's interesting is that when people work with, let's say, species that are far away from us, more distant from us, and let's say less complex, they are much more rigorous in their science. They're much more careful with their conclusions. They'll use different terms than, for example, psychologists will, because they, of course, are looking at humans, but even people working with mammals, right, will be a bit less careful and rigorous and will use different terms. And also what happens is that if you find that something changes in the insects, for example, in the invertebrates, then you'll rethink what you did in the mammals, right? So you'll completely rethink, oh, I thought it was showing this, but if the insect can do it, is it actually showing this or is it something else? So it's super interesting to work with a very broad range of species.
So you have talked about this concept of affect balance. A common question that comes up on this topic is, what about the negative emotions? Because negative emotions are also inevitable and necessary for survival. So how can we achieve this quote unquote good balance?
So first of all, what I want to say is that with affective states, it can be difficult to establish what exactly is a positive state and what is exactly a negative state. So that's, for example, what is a true positive versus just a relative positive? And does it really matter which one it is? And with the negatives, which ones are truly negatives and which ones are actually positive in the long term? So this is a really difficult question. And of course, we want to minimize the negatives. That's still super important. But as you said, some of the negatives have a place to play in the lives of animals and people, and they might have a survival function, although this is a complex issue when we talk about captive animals that are not per se able to act upon their needs. But negatives could also help animals and humans build resilience and competence, which are important skills. So the definition of welfare that I work with is the accumulation and balance of positive and negative affect over time. And then the positive welfare definition also includes this concept of predominantly positive mental state, which clearly includes also negatives because it's not all positive. That's also something we really wanted to make clear in this definition. And I want to be careful with, like, obviously we call them negatives, but are they truly negatives? And which types of negatives are actually positive? But these some of them might be rather important for flourishing in the long term. And a nice paper by Suzanne Monso and Sarah Hinz dives into this philosophical investigation of what might happen when you disenhance animals and remove their ability to feel the negatives. And it's a very interesting paper. When it comes to this balance, because you also asked, what is a good balance? We have to be very careful with this. So currently, if you look at animal welfare definitions that look at balance and say something about this, we could think that they are implying that a 1-to-1 ratio of positive to negatives is like a neutral life. But in humans, this is linked to a depressed life, so a depression. So this is not neutral. This is actually very, very bad because the negatives weigh so much more in our lives. And this is also, I think, true in many species. In our perception, we will have much more, attention for the negatives. So this means that for them to experience, let's say, a neutral state, they need more positives than negatives. So if you want a happy person, you need way more positives than negatives. So we really need to think about this and study various species because in humans, there's a huge individual difference also. There's some people with a ratio of 2 that are super happy, so 2-to-1, who are very happy and satisfied, and other people need a 3-to-1. In marriages, there's a 5-to-1 ratio that had been suggested to be linked to happy marriages. So obviously, there's a huge individual difference, and I think a lot of the human studies also acknowledge this and don't like to mention these ratios too much.
So many great points. Maybe a good one to follow up with is because individual differences play such a big part, how do you tackle this question of individual differences, or how do you account for them and consider them?
I would try to identify indicators that do change for all animals in the same direction, if that's the specific context that we are talking about. If we're talking about applying changes to the environment that we want to be positive for all the animals, I think that's really difficult. And I think the best way is to look at the underlying concepts of the environment. So not a specific thing that you're doing, but rather, are you increasing control? Are you increasing choice? Is your environment complex and varied? Are you more or less providing higher levels of agency? So on, rather than saying, I'm going to give the animals a handful of straw, and I know that's going to increase the welfare of all the animals.
When we ask these questions about animal happiness and quality of life, how can we ensure that we are truly getting at the animal's perspective and not just what we are able to observe that is maybe constrained by the environment they're in? And to maybe ask the difficult question, can there be animal happiness in the current farming systems?
So first of all, I will very carefully venture that I think a lot of us are biased by the systems that we study. So we study, for example, a dairy system. So we're very familiar with a conventional dairy farm. And we study these animals in that system, and then we make conclusions about it in terms of welfare. And I think this bias is what we think very good welfare might look like, because these systems do not allow for that level of welfare, let's say, if you see what I mean. So that's the first part of this answer. The second part of the answer is more about, with what we know about farming today, can we in a captive environment still provide flourishing or allow for flourishing in our farm animals? I think that we can go quite far. I don't know if we can reach flourishing in all our animals or even reach it at all, but I think we could provide pretty good lives by allowing, as I said, for these high levels of control and choice, by providing complex and varied animals that make sense for those species. So think of a more natural farming system. I always think of a mixed farm, so where the animals are actually producing the fertilizer for the crops. So the crops are the main product, the animals that produce the fertilizer there, and therefore you have a recycling of their waste. Also, you can recycle kitchen waste, of course, if you have pigs or crop byproducts. So you get smaller herds, and you tend to get also in these farming systems dual purpose breeds. So all the animals have high value, not just the females, for example. They tend to have more space. You could also add like trees and combine with agroforestry, or what we call silvopastoral systems, and mixed species, so several farming species on these farms. So the species would fulfill different niches, and this would be all nature inclusive, obviously. And we need to go back in time, without forgetting the lessons we have learned, to a more traditional mixed farming system, in my opinion, in order to give these animals more space, more attention, and without damaging our environment, which is not about animal welfare, but still super important.
I love that you've painted this picture of your idea of what an ideal farming system might look like, and the way towards a sustainable system is probably downscaling. That's probably the biggest thing. We're going to pivot a little bit here because our sub-working group, Bridging Disciplines, focuses on interdisciplinary work. Can you tell us a bit about your experiences working interdisciplinarily? For example, you mentioned your work spans human psychology, ethology, and also extending onto on-farm applications as well. What are some challenges you've faced as well as successes? Any tips and tricks you can share?
So first of all, I advise everyone to do this, to at least read a little in other disciplines, or at least other species. It's very enriching, and I think it can teach us a lot. And also, what I love about reading positive psychology literature is that it inspires me in terms of, for example, novel indicators, but also pushing the limits and things like that. In one of our Working Group 2 workshops in Uppsala, I met with these two behavioral ecologists, and they were asking all these super different, super difficult questions we had never asked ourselves, like, why are you doing what you're doing? And how do you know that what you're doing is what you're truly doing, So that was so inspiring. And I'm now working on other projects alongside very different disciplines like landscape architects, toxicophysiologists, entomologists, soil biologists, people working with insects or even mussels. And these discussions with these people are some of the most interesting and enriching I've had. In terms of my own work, I find it very hard to move from the fundamental research to the applied research. I think sometimes we're moving too fast, and other times I feel like we're moving too slow. For example, I'm not sure we currently have any properly validated indicators of positive affect that we could use on farm. But on the other hand, we know so much about the animals, the farm animals we work with, that we could already design better systems, as we discussed in the previous question. We already know some of the underlying mechanisms that are important to animals. Like, in that sense, I think we're moving too slow.
How did you get involved with these different disciplines in the first place?
So there's different ways that these things come about. One of the ways is projects. So, for example, there's a call for a specific project in the Netherlands that's interdisciplinary, and then people approach you. They're looking for an animal welfare specialist, and then they find you. Another way that is coming more from my own interest in this, I proactively approach people within this university who are working on these other disciplines or super cool species like squid. And what's really cool about working at university is that you have all these master students who want cool topics. And I think this is one of the best ways to start these kinds of collaborations. So I have master students now working on silvopastoral farms with soil biologists. I have some working on muscles and heart rate variability or insect cognition. And this is a really nice, easy, relaxed way to explore novel topics.
What I'm kind of getting from that is that you yourself had the curiosity to explore and to connect with other people. So I think the curiosity is a really big aspect with this kind of work, right?
Definitely. You have to be curious, and you also have to be in a place where you see the work of other people in other disciplines.
In light of everything that we've talked about today, I want to ask a question that might seem a bit provocative, but I'd like to think of it as a chance for reflection because scientific knowledge is constantly evolving and growing, and we want this knowledge to be reflected in our practices, right? So, if you could make one major change in the animal production industry to improve animal welfare, working towards positive animal welfare, what would that be? Or is there something that you think is already being done well and you want to encourage that?
So that's a super difficult question. And I think it would depend if I would be allowed to say like underlying things or like specific things. So if I would be allowed to say, okay, just give animals control and choice and agency. So that's like a big, big thing if you think of all the changes required. But in terms of like the underlying concept, it's just one thing, of course. Or if I could change just one system, it would be I would make family dairy herds. So that would be like a cow-calf contact with dual purpose breeds, ideally. So that's still two things, but yeah, that would be something I would love to see more of.
Yeah, I love hearing both the general and also the specific because it's nice to hear from you working with specific breeds and specific systems if you can see a particular change that probably is more practical in that sense because you've been doing the work and you see what systems are working.
Yeah, something that I struggle with is this idea that we produce animals and have all these like low value unwanted, sometimes unwanted animals in the dairy and egg industry. So this dual purpose breed thing is somehow also very important to me. I think we need to rethink the way that we produce animals so that there's no low value, what we call surplus animals.
Yeah, because they are treated, it's not a really nice word to say, but they are treated like waste products. And
Mm. Yep.
if we see them as low value, then the treatment is also not positive.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a system in the Netherlands called the Kipster, and they are raising the male chicks of the layer hens. So they are being raised for meat without, I think, changing the breed per se. They're also trying to have a circular system, which is part of it, of course, raising the males, it's part of it, but trying to close the cycle. So it's quite cool.
That reminds me a bit of also the veal meat industry. Again, creating another purpose for them so they don't have their life cut short at just a few days old. It is quite a challenging topic to talk about, isn't it? To not end on too sad of a note, I think it's a nice place to come full circle and to think about positive animal welfare. So, Laura, what does positive animal welfare mean to you? What does that look like for the animals?
Yeah, so I think the definition of poor is pretty much what I would aim for. So animals able to flourish by expressing or experiencing many positive states relative to the negative ones, able to acquire information across time, develop competences, primarily competences that are relevant to the species. Of course, you can think of these games they develop in pigs, which are super nice too, that they can interact with other people via a touch screen. It's nice if it's also includes like naturalness and relevant aspects to the species. And this would mean for me intact animals with choice and control in a complex and variable environment. This is what I already touched upon, in which individuality can be expressed. So each animal can express their own agency, but also intelligence. So, for example, things like nutritional intelligence. And we would be moving way beyond, ensuring good physical health and preventing and alleviating suffering towards this dot on the horizon that I mentioned, and really aiming for rich lives and flourishing animals.
Thank you so much for your time today. And it was really, really nice speaking with you on these topics.
Thanks so much for inviting me to do this. It's been super fun. I never did a podcast before, so it was a new experience for me, but thank you.
Thank you.